more than compostable cups and reusable bags. And thanks very much to Mini Events Australia for having me along to present on this. So just to start off, a little bit about myself. Well, there we go. As I said, my name's Jacqui. I'm a principal consultant at Edge Environment. I have over a decade of sustainability experience. I work across lots of different areas, but of course today I'm specifically here to talk about events and how sustainability relates to events. I also work with a lot of different clients, which gives me some insight into how lots of different sectors deal with sustainability, not just sort of public-private, but also different industry sectors as well. And I have a passion, as does everyone at Edge, to drive impacts and outcomes related to not just the sustainability strategy, but the organisation's overall strategy and how sustainability fits in with that. And I'm also a Sustainable Events Accredited practitioner, which means I've gone through a registration and qualification process with that organisation. A little bit about Edge Environment too. I think the slides are just a little bit slow through this medium. There we go. So Edge is a consultancy. We help clients to ingrain sustainability into cultures, both for responsible and commercial performance. And I think the key about Edge, you can read the rest of that, but the main thing is we work solely in sustainability. So this is all we do. It's also at the heart of our mission as an organisation. I'm not sure whether everyone is aware of B Corp certification, but we are a certified B Corporation, which is a certification process that looks at economic, environmental and social sustainability and also governance issues within an organisation, and make sure that basically you have strong values at the centre of your business. So that's something we're very proud of, and something that we obviously, sustainability is an area that we're very passionate about, and we love working in this area. Just admitting a few more people into the conversation. And someone mentioned maybe that I'm a little bit quiet. I hope for most people that you can hear me well. I've just turned up my volume a little bit in case that helps. And then, so I've just been through introductions of who I am and who Edge is, and now we'll get stuck right in. So I really wanted to start with the why. Why are we interested in sustainability? And there's a couple of different things that we can look at here. One, of course, is the moral imperative. And I don't know whether anyone is aware of who this might be, who said, our common home is being pillaged, laid waste and harmed with impunity. Cowardice in defending it is a grave sin. Maybe the sin word pops up with some ideas for people there. So this was actually from Pope Francis. He's very strong on sustainability issues, and I'm not being religious myself. I find it really interesting that with a change in the leader there, that they've actually come out with values and linked it into what it means to be a good Catholic, I guess. Whether or not you see that moral imperative, there are now, a couple more people just joining, there are now also some very clear business drivers as well. So as an organisation, you may have already started to see that awareness around these issues of sustainability is growing, and the expectations have risen around what good sustainability practice is, and there's a lot of reasons for this. One is, of course, it's getting more publicity generally. There's shows such as the ABC's War on Waste, very popular and very high rating as generally as far as things on sustainability goes, and brought home some of these issues that are really remarkable to see, the waste that happens in society, and started to look at how we might deal with that too. There's obviously the ban on plastic bags that has happened recently with Woolworths and Coles. Of course, the Coles ban wasn't without its slight hiccups, but it shows how expectations around these things have changed. There's also an understanding and connection of more global issues to their impacts at our door. So one of those issues, of course, is climate change leading to rising sea temperatures and causing coral bleaching on our Great Barrier Reef. A very widespread event a couple of years ago, and they see this as an ongoing challenge for the Great Barrier Reef. And at the moment, in New South Wales particularly, but also across the East Coast, obviously a drought which is affecting all of our farmers and affecting, in the end, also food supply for people, even if you're in an urban area, these sort of issues will affect that as well, will affect you. So expectations have risen, awareness has grown around these issues. We're also seeing organisations increasingly relate sustainability to events and showing basically that event sustainability is an important part of meeting sustainability outcomes. The City of Sydney is obviously really strong on this. Anyone working in the city area will know that. Local government New South Wales also has an event sustainability principles and guidelines document, as well as some basic guidance there. You'll find sustainability across a lot of, I know at least in Sydney, which is where I'm based, but probably also more nationally, definitely a lot down in Victoria as well. You'll see a lot of local governments with their own managed events policies, and at a university level as well, really strong practice in sustainability coming out of some of the universities. And they're obviously from the public institutions, but there's private organisations as well with really strong, at the corporate level, really strong sustainability commitments that go into their events policies too. So whether you take a moral approach that it's something that we all need to improve on, or whether you're more interested in what the drivers are coming from clients and customers, sustainability is definitely something that can't be ignored anymore. So I now wanted to turn to the what, because it's really easy to use the word sustainability and to not be exactly clear what we're talking about. And the word sustainability has its origins in a report from 1987. There's a snapshot on the cover on the right-hand side there. It's like a fantastically 1980s looking report. And it's the most commonly quoted definition of sustainability. It's where the term's seen to have originated from an environmental sense and in the current context. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And it's a lovely general definition. The problem is when we try to put this into practice, it can be a little bit too general. And so we really need to drill down into what this actually means. What does this mean in practice? And there's three components to sustainability: the environmental, the social and the economic. The social and the economic are often, if not ignored, then underplayed. So it's important to recognise that sustainability is where all those three things meet, and it's not sustainable unless all of those three criteria are met. And again, what will environmental, social and economic, what will actually sit in these circles for different organisations? And will it be the same for everyone? It's a bit of a difficult format to get answers back from that rhetorical question, but I'm sure you'll all guess the answer is no. It won't be the same for everyone. And what do we have to do to try and establish what sits in those three circles? And this is what I want to work through today, to actually put this into practice and say, well, how do we actually determine what sits within sustainability for your organisation, what it means for you, and what to do with that to put it into action. So establishing what sustainability means will have 4 components. The first one, and I'll drill down into all these in a little bit more detail in the following slides, but just at a top level, the first one is stakeholder inclusiveness. So this is basically identifying who is a stakeholder in your organisation and how you can respond to their expectations. The next one is sustainability context, and this is what matters in your sectoral, local, regional and global context. We then look at materiality, which is really just a fancy word for saying what are your big impacts on the environment, socially or economically. And then the issue of completeness. So completeness says, are we being consistent in our time and organisational boundaries? So are we always, do we have a clear rule for setting what matters and drawing a boundary around that? So just in a little bit more detail, each of these 4 concepts. The first one is about stakeholders. And so stakeholder inclusiveness basically says we identify the stakeholders. We've got internal stakeholders here, employees, management and owners, and then we have external stakeholders. And of course, external stakeholders will vary for every organisation in every context, but you've got some pretty standard ones: people that supply you goods or services, clients and customers, anyone that funds your organisation or your events would be considered an external stakeholder. You may also consider associations like MEA, or perhaps there's other associations that you're part of as part of your stakeholder group. And then there's society more generally as well, the community particularly in which an event might be held. They're all part of your stakeholder group. So trying to establish what matters to them. The next step is to look at the sustainability context. And I thought it was easiest to talk about this in terms of an example. Sorry, one second. Yeah, so this is looking in terms of what matters from a sectoral, local, regional and global context. But my example is from some work we did with Taronga Zoo. And Taronga Zoo, of course, is located on the shore of Sydney Harbour. Beautiful location, very important conservation mission at the heart of the organisation. And we were looking at their options for serving food and beverages on site. And basically, there was a lot of different criteria that they were looking at in terms of environmental sustainability. But within their context, one of the most significant things for them was that they couldn't be seen to contribute to any litter around the zoo. They didn't want anything that has been, that has originated on site to find its way, for example, into the harbour as people that are coming over to the zoo travel to and from the zoo by ferry. So there's a lot of activity down by the water, and they didn't want any potential litter ending up in the harbour that was, well, no litter at all, but definitely nothing that wasn't biodegradable. So no plastics to end up in the harbour and potentially damaging marine life. And for them, that was at the heart of their sectoral context, or their context of their mission and what they're trying to achieve as an organisation, and therefore was at the heart of what we were trying to help them work through in terms of sustainability outcomes. And that ends up being very interesting in terms of what you can do with serverware and what that then means, for example, with waste contractors and having to pick up different sorts of organic matter potentially instead of plastics, because you have perhaps things that have been served with food in them that are now contaminated and need to go into waste streams that weren't there originally. So it ended up being a really interesting little study with Taronga Zoo, but that's just a little example of what mattered for them in their context. The next one is materiality. And this is basically, as I said, sounds much more complex than it is. It's looking at what matters, what environmental, social, economic issues matter in terms of their impact. And these are just some examples on the left here, but we often find when we look at events, one of the biggest impacts is travel to and from the event, travel and transport to and from the event for people attending the event. So that's usually carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions associated with that travel, and especially if you have international attendees flying in, you'll have a lot of carbon emissions associated with plane travel. You might also have energy use on site being a large impact. That could just be electricity, or it might also be backup generators, which use a lot of energy and produce a lot of emissions. Obviously waste, a key consideration with events. We have people coming and consuming things at the event, often in a sort of a takeaway format. Water consumption, general event consumables, and the impacts associated with them. So that includes, for example, when you're serving food on site, there's obviously energy and resources that have gone into producing that food. So a key example there is that when you're serving vegetarian options, they're likely to have a lower overall environmental impact than your red meat options, as an example. There's also social issues to consider and economic issues, local business. So often for events that are being run in a community sort of setting, there's local business impacts. And might also be diversity and inclusion issues, not just for attendees, but also for the procurement that you undertake and the goods and services that you buy. They're all issues that you may want to take into account in terms of the major impacts of an event. And finally, looking at completeness. So completeness is about where you draw this boundary in terms of where you're, having looked at what matters to your stakeholders, what's relevant in terms of your context, and what matters in terms of your impact, you then draw a boundary that's consistent in terms of how you're going to deal with those things. So just taking paper as an example, if you're looking at how you use paper for an event, you can draw a very small boundary around perhaps the paper used in your office, and that might be people printing things for meetings, which is really minor compared to the practices of the venue and what's going on at the venue. And then again, the paper consumables of attendees. And you might even look as wide as the source of that paper, how it's transported, and then where it's disposed at the end of its life to get a full picture of the impacts and the issues associated with that. So that's just, I guess, one example of a good to help you understand how a boundary might be set at different levels, and whether, of course, some things it might be relevant to look at just in terms of your organisation, but in order to be complete, you're probably going to have to look a little bit further than that in most instances as an event organisation. So just a little recap, those 4 issues again: stakeholder inclusiveness, sustainability context, materiality and completeness. And they're a really good starting point to establish what matters in terms of sustainability for your organisation. And I thought we'd now just turn to a couple of examples. And these go a little bit wider than that sort of starting point of sustainability. And they sort of look at how you might deal with sustainability at a bigger level. And I've got 3 examples. One, we worked with the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games, so it's obviously a very large event, a mega event. So a few examples of what they've done to try and tackle sustainability at their level. A smaller event called Purpose, which is an annual conference run in Sydney. And then a little bit of an example of what you might even do down at a single meeting level if you were just running a business meeting that was a fairly simple one room and a single event organisation. So the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games as a starting point. It was run in April this year, it's the 5th time Australia has hosted the Commonwealth Games. The majority of the events were held across 3 major areas. There were over 6,000 athletes in 71 nations that came along. So a huge event, especially in Australia's context of holding events. It's very large. Took, of course, many years of planning. And the approach to sustainability was quite ingrained from the beginning. So it was part of the initial bid. They then developed this strategy that you can see up on the screen here. They had a vision to show leadership in sustainability by delivering the Gold Coast 2018 Games to international standards of best practice, leaving positive economic, environmental, social and community legacies. And they had these 9 different pillars of sustainability in areas that they were working across. And so these were the things they decided in consultation with their stakeholders that mattered to them. These were the areas that they saw they could really impact and make a difference on. So you can see some of these are very much environment focused and some of them are economic and socially focused as well. And important to have that balance there. I won't go through all of these in detail. You'll see also that there is, and inevitably this is the case, some of the categories do relate to each other. We worked with them on the sustainable procurement category to responsibly manage their supply chain and enhance performance through sustainable sourcing and material selection practices. And so we helped them put in place strategies, policies and analysis to work out what mattered for them in terms of their procurement impacts and how they might go about dealing with them. And as you might guess, procurement is one of those categories that really underpins a lot of other sustainability impacts because a lot of the goods and services that you purchase then feed into other things. Obviously, waste is a key one, but also carbon emissions, food and beverage. They're all very much related to the procurement approach. So just 2 examples of things that we did. We worked with them for over 3 years. So there's a lot of different bits and pieces to how we supported their procurement work. But one of the key things that we delivered was a sustainable sourcing code. And I've got the link down there. If you, I guess one of the great things about the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games is they have a mission to leave a positive legacy. So everything they generated through the Games is all publicly available. So if you're interested in this document, you can find it at that link. The code includes a commitment to sustainability, so that makes it clear what sustainability means for them and how they're dealing with it. Purpose and the scope of the document, so that's setting those boundaries around what's included and what's excluded, and then some guiding principles which fall out into actual requirements and aspirations. So there were minimum requirements across each of these principles and then aspirational targets as well. So the responsible sourcing, which is sort of largely in the social category, looked at labour rights, workplace health and safety, also had requirements for food certification and animal welfare. Value for money, so that's largely sitting in the economic category, looked at whole of life cost and also non-cost factors such as quality, service and support. We also looked at minimising embodied and operational impacts of the materials that they purchased. And we have minimum standards in there around wood products, electronic equipment, travel, PVC paints, a whole lot of other things as well. And then there was also requirements around inclusivity and diversity, and particularly focused on local industry. They were trying very much to generate employment and opportunities within the Gold Coast area, and also opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So as I said, minimum requirements and then aspirational targets across each of those areas, and then reporting obligations for not only the organisation themselves, but all of the suppliers that they worked with. They asked them to help with their reporting against those principles. Another thing that we worked with them on was a materials and packaging guideline, and this will be particularly interesting Particularly interesting, sorry, I'm just reading a comment in the chat box, asked, can I email the links? I think that won't be a problem. I might get the help of MEA to do that, but that should be easy to do. And of course, this presentation and a recording of the webinar will be available online too. So this materials and packaging guideline basically goes through the detail of the policies they had in place to try and reduce waste and improve recycling in both front of house and back of house areas. At a high level, it requires that materials and packaging be fit for purpose. So if the goods that are being packaged are not arriving in a safe state, then of course any sustainability initiatives will be won't have worked, because you'll have to source the goods again. So it needs to be fit for purpose, resource efficient, so use as few resources as possible, include information about appropriate disposable, and be purchased in bulk to reduce outer shell wrappings, so trying to avoid individually wrapped small items. And just a little bit more detail on here, if you're interested in waste, as I said, there's more detail in the actual document. But it was important to them that the plastics that came on site fit into Australia's main recycling infrastructure. So within Australia, I'm sure you're all aware of the plastic recycling codes. There is a little triangle of arrows going around in 3 corners with a number in the middle. So pick 1 and pick 2 are really the only plastic recycling codes that are widely recyclable within Australia. So it's important that the plastics coming into the site needed to be either one of those 2 codes, and they needed to be labelled as such. Cardboard packaging. Sorry, just admitting a couple more people to the meeting a little bit belatedly. Cardboard packaging containing a high percentage of post-consumer recycled content or chain of custody certification if the content was not recycled. So that's making sure that the paper has come from sustainable sources, high percentage of recycled content in glass, and requirements around litter reduction to avoid separable components. So they really wanted to make sure that when people were being given, for example, foods in takeaway containers, they were given as fewer separable components as possible. So for example, little plastic components couldn't become separated and end up as litter, and potentially outside of the Gold Coast area, potentially washing, for example, into waterways or things like that. So that was a real concern for them. So that's just a little bit of an overview. As I said, you can see more detail in the actual document. The next example I have is the Purpose Conference. So this is a much smaller event. It's an annual conference bringing together businesses that are driven by purpose. Basically, it's a little bit different. It's not so much your standard conference. It's more, they consider themselves a non-conference, which has things like excursions and nature and music, and is designed to shift perspectives a little bit, something a little bit different. Some things that they've done is within their attendee packs, everyone got given reusable coffee mugs. So there was no coffee cups, actually, no disposable coffee cups on site. There were refilling stations for water, so high quality reusable tote bags. There was minimal paper given as part of sort of participant materials and things like that. They also offered a lot of vegetarian options within their catering. I actually don't know if they did any meat. I think they were almost entirely vegetarian. And we worked with them to have a look at their carbon footprint. And this is just a really quick snapshot. There was a lot of other detail sitting behind this, but having done so much on their site, what was obvious was the biggest impacts for them, and this again is similar to a lot of other conferences and meetings, is travel. So one of the big things that they could do was focus on providing people with sustainable options for travel, picking venues that were easy to access by public transport. And this year they've done that. They're going to a site in Sydney called the Commune, has access and parking by car, but is also very accessible by train and bus. And they're promoting that as the preferable way to get to the conference site this year. And then I guess down at so we've got a big mega event and a medium-sized event, and I just thought it was worth just saying, even at the single meeting level, there's lots that can be done. It's this is just a little bit of a snapshot. There's many guides and information online about what you can do for a single meeting as well. I think if you're interested and wanting to just start small, it's very easy to do. But here are some examples. So I've said this a few times, but venue choice, obviously, and how sustainable a venue is, and particularly how easy it is to access by modes of transport that are low carbon emitting modes of transport, is a very important starting point. Another thing which sits more in this sort of social category, but might be important for you and for your organisation, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander catering supplies. There's just this fantastic website called Supply Nation. If you haven't looked at it, you definitely should. I've singled out catering because it's an area where there's lots of suppliers. And this website basically vets and registers Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses that you can then access to supply goods or services into your event or any other. It's not event specific, but it's a very good website. Vegetarian and locally sourced foods, teleconferencing solutions, that again avoids travel, eliminating use of disposable cutlery and crockery, online registration and ensuring space and catering for final numbers. I'm sure online registration is basically standard, given that it's also a time saver. Electronic sharing of meeting materials and appropriate waste disposable options. So they're just some really quick options. Again, there's many more that you can do. It depends on the sort of event you're running and where it is. And so I just wanted to reiterate now where we start if you're starting out on your sustainability journey. And after this section, we'll just open up to some questions. So if you have any questions that you're wanting to ask, feel free to start typing them in the chat box, and I'll get to them at the end of this section. So we start with establishing what sustainability means for you, for your organisation, and in your context. We look at these 4 issues: stakeholder inclusiveness, identifying and responding to your stakeholders' expectations, looking at the context that you operate in, what matters in your sector, but also in your local, regional, and global context. Materiality, so what are the big impacts of the events that you run, and how can you influence these? And you really want to tackle the ones where you feel that you can influence them. And completeness, considering time and organisational boundaries and making sure that we're not leaving anything important out. And you can begin with a good policy. So when you've worked out what these, what matters and what sustainability means for you, the important thing to do is to put this into a policy. Policy helps document and I think show everyone your commitment to sustainability, but gives you a reference document too to make sure there's some consistency over time. It shows at a high level your commitment, an overview of what the key issues are for you in terms of sustainability. It may include goals, objectives, and indicators, or it could connect to a plan or a strategy that does those things. And a good policy also has monitoring, reporting, and review processes. So you make it clear how you are going to actually look at this over time and try and improve. And I just have some sort of checklists here across environmental, social, and economic issues. I don't want to go into them in detail because I think we've sort of touched on a lot of it anyway, but when you're starting the conversation around what might matter, these are categories that you could look at and ask yourself whether it's relevant to the events that you run. So for example, land use might not be an issue for you if you are mainly using large indoor venues that are in a city and have already been established. Land use might be a significant issue if you're using perhaps more greenfield sites where you need to bring in a lot of materials onto a site, and you need to consider how that's going to impact the area where you're working. So they'll be different depending on the sort of events that you run, but there's a little bit of a checklist from an environmental perspective, and then from a social perspective, issues of local business, diversity and inclusion, procurement, labour rights, workplace health and safety, and also potentially training and education opportunities are all worth considering within your approach to social sustainability. And then checklists from an economic perspective, value for money and whole of life cost. So this is looking at the cost of goods and services over their full lifetime, not just their upfront cost. And in that way, you can take into account some of the, for example, resources they use through their operating life. So when you come to use an electronic good, obviously if you get something that's cheap up front but uses a lot of energy over time, it may end up actually costing you more. Fair competition within your processes and good governance as well. So they're just issues that you might want to consider from an economic perspective. And overall, and this would be then taking that starting point of your deciding what matters and looking at developing a policy. It can then work through the standard, so there's an ISO 2020 or 20121 standard for event sustainability. It's probably a little bit in depth for what a lot of people need to do, but the standard has these 4 categories, which is really at the heart of a lot of management standards, the plan, do, check, act categories. And the basic process is I've listed out there and can, I guess, start you on your journey from that initial engagement and determine the scope of what you're looking at and the issues that are important to you, to establishing the policy, responsibilities and targets, and then a plan to achieve them, train people if necessary, monitor and evaluate your progress, and identify any issues and opportunities and take action. There's a lot more detail on that standard and many guides online in the link at the bottom of this page that's now up in front of us. There's also a huge amount of resources out there in terms of sustainability and implementing it in event processes. So the Sustainable Event Alliance is an organisation. It's global, but it's largely Australia-based with lots of resources that you can draw on. There's very good practice out of the UK and a lot of information about how sustainability can be integrated in events. One example up there is eventimpacts.com. Have a look at that. Supply Nation, I mentioned, as a great resource for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander run businesses. And there's also, I think, some of the best sustainable event guides come out of universities. I put down here Macquarie Uni and RMIT because I think they're both good examples, but there's lots more out there as well. And I guess this is really a starting point for what could be a great sustainability journey, but a few options for you there to have a look at for more information.